Good morning, Chair Kenny Geyer and members of the committee. My name is Mary Kyle McCurdy, Deputy Director at 1000 Friends of Oregon. 1000 Friends of Oregon supports housing that meets the needs of all Oregonians while protecting our resource lands from sprawl. That means we promote diverse housing in all communities where people have access to work, school, healthcare, public amenities, and transit. And that's what Oregon's land use planning program, Goal 10, calls for too. Goal 10's, the housing goal, says, plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels which are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households and allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. Those words were written in the late 1970s and are yet as reflective today of the values of Oregonians as they were back then. We want all our neighborhoods, towns, and cities to be welcoming places of opportunity for all Oregonians, and that includes diverse housing types located in areas of opportunity. Yet, we have fallen short on this goal, and that's why 1000 Friends of Oregon supports House Bill 2007. This bill takes important steps to better ensure our towns and cities are providing for the housing needs of all in every neighborhood. We support the bill's objectives to ensure that every city provides clear and objective standards for all residential development on land zoned for residential use, to provide more opportunities for missing middle housing types of accessory units and duplexes, and ensures that decisions made about historic districts are made locally by publicly elected bodies through transparent processes and not through the current workaround of the National Historic District designation, which is not a public process made by local publicly elected bodies. Today, there's almost no city in Oregon in which a family making the median income can afford the median priced home for rent or purchase based on paying 30% of one's income on housing. That inability to find affordable, well-located housing is impacting middle and lower income Oregonians. We often hear the term housing crisis to describe the situation we're in, and I bristle at that term because I think it implies that this situation happened quickly and we'll just find that one magic tool and we'll have it solved. Neither of those is true. There are many reasons for the situation that we find ourselves in, many of which have nothing to do with land use. But land use does have a role to play in both the problem and the solutions. Oregon cities are experiencing a long-standing structural mismatch between the amount, type, location, and affordability of housing that Oregonians need, and how our cities and towns have zoned their residential lands for decades. The structural mismatch has been exacerbated by the population increases in many of our communities. Our residential zoning has simply not kept up with the changing demographics and needs of middle and lower income Oregon families, and we will continue to fall farther behind without action. As you heard the gentleman from Central City concerned, we're 100,000 units short at all price levels in Oregon, and that is growing. Every community, how did we get here? You've heard a little bit of this already. Every community in Oregon, and this is nationally, has a similar profile in which 2/3 of all households are 1 to 2 people in size. This is a long-term trend, and the percentage is growing. These are young couples who have not yet started a family, an older couple whose children are grown, the 20-something just starting out, the 70-something widow, the single parent with 1 or 2 children. There are nurses, teachers, electricians, medical technicians, the person who waited on you somewhere today. They want to live in walkable neighborhoods with good schools, age in their neighborhood that they raise their children in, and live near the places they work. Yet the vast majority of residential land in all of our communities is zoned for single-family detached housing on lots of 5,000 square feet or more. In Portland, 90% of all the residential land is zoned for detached single-family housing. In Medford, it's 67%. That's a pretty typical range. It has been that way since the 1950s. We've zoned most of our residential lands in ways that functionally exclude a large percentage of Oregonians at any price, with housing types that just don't fit their housing family sizes, and certainly economically exclude many of them. This is not an outcome that reflects Oregon values or Goal 10 for that matter, and it's time, I think, to rethink just what we mean by a single-family neighborhood. Today's families come in all shapes and sizes and income levels, and all should have the opportunity to live in all neighborhoods. Whether it's the widow who wants to stay in her own neighborhood after the kids are grown, and so an attached cottage cluster makes sense, or the intergenerational family for whom a duplex or a triplex is perfect, or the returning college student who lives in their parents' ADU. But these options are prohibited in many of our single-family neighborhoods. We should be focusing on the form of the housing and structures and not so much on the number of units inside it, which you saw illustrated earlier by Eli Spivak's slideshow. Our towns and cities find themselves in this structural mismatch and affordable housing needs for many reasons. Some of it is simple neglect. Some of those land use plans that Rob described have not been updated for residential zoning since the 1980s. And some of it is through actions. The primary means of building wealth in the United States is through home ownership. And yet, as we all know, historically, many of our single-family neighborhoods that exist today were not open to non-white people. And so that path to owning a home in every neighborhood was not available to all. And we see the impacts of that remaining today. Today, Oregonians in towns and cities across the state are experiencing other housing barriers of not clear and objective standards, vague design criteria. Design criteria do not have to be vague, and I do believe design's criteria is important, but it doesn't have to be vague. And they're experiencing limits on diverse housing types, infill development, redevelopment, and development on smaller lots through outright prohibition, and the misuse of a National Historic District designation to prevent change. This has resulted in insufficient housing supply, lack of needed diversity in housing, and more expensive housing and more economically segregated neighborhoods. There are certainly reasonable regulations on housing to protect trees, natural resources, and to ensure that the scale of housing is appropriate, getting back to form and scale. But as many studies have documented, local zoning restrictions that leave intact the historical notion of what a single-family neighborhood is by zoning out the missing middle housing types and preventing diverse housing through infill and redevelopment are having a detrimental impact on housing affordability for middle and lower income families citywide, statewide, in all our towns. And the results of this, by keeping these housing types out of many of our neighborhoods, is resulting in displacement and gentrification of lower income neighborhoods as certain neighborhoods become off limits financially and exclude housing types that most Oregonians need at some point in their lives. In contrast, providing robust opportunities in all of our neighborhoods for more diverse missing middle housing types, including ADUs, duplexes, infill, and redevelopment, will result in both more and more affordable housing. But if most of our cities' neighborhoods are walled off to anything except detached single-family homes on larger lots, we will continue our march towards ever greater unaffordability and exclusion of many from ever owning a home. I'm going to quote just a few studies and then end. Quote, when new housing development is precluded in neighborhoods with political capital to implement even stricter local barriers, the new housing that does get built tends to be disproportionately concentrated in low-income communities of color, causing displacement and concerns of gentrification in those neighborhoods. Rising rents region-wide can exacerbate that displacement. A large and growing body of empirical research has now demonstrated that restrictions on housing diversity and density cause unexpected unintended harms. They radically inflate housing costs, segregate neighborhoods by class, displace longstanding residents by pricing them out of their rented homes, and amplify economic disparities between rich and poor, eliminate opportunities for working people to improve their lots in life, and trap children in poverty. And in the new exclusionary zoning, an exhaustive academic review of urban exclusionary zoning published in 2014 in the Stanford Law Review, the advent of historic preservation in the 1960s is also part of this trend. Historic preservation districts effectively remove parts of the city from the stock of developable land and impose additional approvals for development within them. This makes development more expensive or prevents it outright, both of which raise housing prices in high-demand areas. The solution to meeting the housing needs of all Oregon families is not to push them to the edge or out of a city, or to exclude them from certain neighborhoods, or to offer them just an apartment on the 8th floor of a building. We can do better. I'm going to quote in ending from AARP, a strong supporter of opening up all single-family neighborhoods to missing middle housing types, who stated, "We are all born. We all need certain things as a small child, teenager, young adult, young family, empty nester, person living alone, and older adult. So let's plan for everyone along that life cycle." House Bill 2007 provides a great start to fulfilling the Oregon values reflected in Goal 10 by opening up opportunities in all neighborhoods for all families. Thank you.